Hi everyone, today we'll continue going over the CKS question bank. Next, let's look at the second question, which is about TLS secrets. The main purpose of this question is to use an SSL file stored within it to secure external server access. That's the main focus of this question. The files we'll be using are the two listed below, and the specific paths are already provided here. You don't need to memorize these paths, right? During the exam, the question will also provide them. These two files are our certificate and key, right? The one above is the certificate, CRT, and the key is the key file, so there are two files in total. Also, something else to pay attention to here is that our deployment has already been configured. It's already set up specifically for our TLS secret, so do not modify the existing deployment. Everyone should be careful about this. This applies to all the following questions as well. As long as something is not mentioned in the question, try not to modify it. So what do we change? We only change what's required by the question. For everything else, just leave it as it is. Keep it unchanged. The main task here is in this one. In the clear namespace, there is an existing deployment, specifically named clear. For our current and existing deployment, we absolutely need to create a new TMS secret, which will be precisely named clear. That is indeed the primary and most crucial requirement of this particular question, forming the main content and core objective. Next, let us take a much closer and more detailed look at the situation. So, how exactly do we effectively solve this complex problem? First of all, as is typically customary and usual, what exactly do we fundamentally need to do? We need to carefully switch to the corresponding and relevant directory. Well, not directory, but switch to the corresponding node, switch to the correct node, because right now we're on the base node. We need to use a command to remotely connect to another node, and then start from there. Carry out the necessary operations. Alright, next, let's take a look at exactly how we should handle this issue. How to create our secret. First, we can see the current state of our pod, which is the same as what we saw at the end of the previous step. As long as you make absolutely certain that everything here is properly running, with the notable exception of the two ingress pods which have already completed their operations, the other significant one is the specific pod for this particular exercise, which is currently in a creating state, indicating it is still being initialized. As long as you keep it like this, you can continue to the next steps. Now, I've already connected to our master 01. After connecting, let's take a look at the specific operations. How should we handle this issue? First of all, the requirement of the question is that we use these two files, right? We need to use these two certificate files to create our secret. So first, what we can see right now is that the abnormal pod is actually the same one we saw in the very first question. This question is actually about that. It's a pod that isn't running properly. A pod that isn't running properly. As for its status, right now it's in the process of being created, currently being created. So next, what can we do? We can start with the second step, which is to store the generated certificate and key in our secret object. First of all, everyone should pay attention to this here. There are actually two ways to create it. One is by using a file, and the other is by using a command. Honestly, they're pretty much the same, so you just need to remember one of them. Whether you create the secret through a file or through a command, the ultimate goal is the same. We just need to successfully create our secret. Relatively speaking, if you want to write fewer commands, and if you just write them directly in the command line, you don't have to worry too much about formatting. But if you write them in a file, what kind of problem might you encounter? What do you need to pay attention to? You need to pay attention to the formatting of our YML file, right? Indentation, various symbols. If you make a mistake here, right? It's not a big deal, but if you do make a mistake, you'll have to spend more time troubleshooting. So, as much as possible, everyone should just use commands. Just use commands directly. That's the most convenient. If you use commands, it's basically like there's nothing like that to worry about. This should be called... But there's no formatting to worry about. You just write everything in sequence. So here first, what do? We first specify our current namespace, specify the namespace, and then create the secret, which is create. Right, after creating the secret, what do we do next? Next, we add the specific content we want to create, which is our TLS. As for the name, it was actually mentioned above, right? The name here is actually the same as our namespace name. It's the same as the namespace name. Alright, so we specify it like this, and then what do we do next? Next, we use our two options to specify what? To specify our corresponding two items. Files, right? As for those two files, first, one is the certificate file and the other is the key file. So which option corresponds to the certificate file? That would be our cert. Actually, for this certificate, whether it's HTTPS, TLS, or others, the format of our certificate is basically the same. Because for the most part, the ones we use, the ones we adopt, You could say we mainly use external services, basically. It's mainly ingress, because actually later on with ingress, right, as you can see ingress here, its full name is actually ingress index. So as for the certificate format we use here, it's generally a CRT certificate file and a key file for the private key. Of course, different web services might have some differences, but this is how we do it. One certificate, one key. For some external services, there might even be just a single file, while others require 2 files. Now here, the first thing we need to do is specify the paths to these 2 files. One thing everyone needs to pay attention to is when specifying the file paths, what should you always use? You must always use absolute paths. Of course, in the exercise, the paths provided are actually absolute paths, right? Let's take a look. In the exercise, what they've given us is actually an absolute path, right? From the home directory all the way to the end under the root's home directory. So here we can just use it directly. Using the absolute path is totally fine. You can just use the absolute path. There's really no need to write a relative path here, basically, right? It's actually not easy to write a relative path in this case. Of course, right now, where are we? We're actually in this... We're actually in the home directory of the user candidate, right? Yeah, we're inside their home directory. So if you write a relative path now, it actually just means a path starting from the CCRT location. But since the problem statement already gives you the absolute path, you should just use the path provided in the question. Don't try to make up your own relative path here, because that could cause problems. Because on our side, as for the options here, they don't support the relative path format. So here what we need is to write the full path. In this case, we use our... First, there's the certificate, right? For the certificate, it's the cert option, then equals, and then you start writing the path in the home directory with your username, that is the current user you're using. Then, as for the path, let's take a look at what the question gives us. The path given in the question is... It's CCRT, then web.kbs.r, local CRT. All right. So here after home, in the directory, we then proceed to add theccert file. Then the next part of the path is our web. K's local cert. So this cert is our... This is our first certificate file. Of course, this command is quite long and I haven't finished typing it yet. The line isn't over. If I keep typing to the right of my avatar, it'll get blocked. So here, I'll just add a line break. So // line break. We'll keep writing because you can actually keep writing here. It's just that my head is blocking the command line, so we'll write on a new line, then continue with the next line, and then add another K. Our second option, which is our key option, equals. The path here is actually the same, so the previous part of the path is identical. Then for the latter part, just change it to ccert. Then add another dash in this web.rkys. Local is this last option, not the last one, but the suffix is different. Just the suffix is different. Now let's execute it here. Note it must be... Specify the full path. Also, since both of our options are long options, we need to use 2 dashes. Pay attention to this part, CRT here, right, 2 dashes. And for the K here as well, it's also 2 dashes. Now let's press enter to execute. Okay, the execution here shows that the secret has been created. Next, what can we do? Let's take a look at the secret we just created. Its name as well as the time. And also the data here. Actually, these few parameters are nothing special. It's just n, and we add this. The name of the namespace, then use getSecret to check it. Alright, what we have here is the secret we just created a moment ago, created 24 seconds ago. There are a total of 2 data entries, and what do these 2 data entries actually refer to? They refer to our 2 files. This data is actually our files. Of course, when it comes to secrets, there are actually many types. They can be certificate key files, right? And what else can they be? They can also be... For example, things like password types, encrypted passwords, certificate key files, and so on. All of these can actually be considered our secrets. Yes, they can all be considered secrets, including, for example, if you want to log into a local or other image repository. Logging into an image repository can also involve storing authentication information like usernames and passwords in a secret, so there are many types of secrets. Here we're using the certificate type, which is set up through files. There are 2 files. Alright, that's how we create it. Once it's created, just wait a little while, just a little bit. Right now it's been about a minute or so. Let's wait for about 1 to 2 minutes, at most around 3 minutes. After at most 3 minutes, we can start checking our deployment and take a look at it and see if its status is normal. Actually, you can check the deployment, right? Or you can also check where did it go. Let's look for it. Here it is, right? This is also ours. This is actually a pod in our current namespace. This is a pod in our current namespace. So here, earlier, it also included the deployment name. So here you can check the deployment or you can check here. Actually, if you want to write a simple command, it's just get pod will do, really. Of course, if you want to be more precise and don't want to see so much information, it's best to add n, right? We can add the name of our namespace, which will make it more accurate. Okay, we can see that it's already running normally. It's already running normally. If you're still not sure, you can also, actually, there's nothing much here, but if you're wondering why it's not set up yet, we can take a look. Here we can see that actually the name, right? Let's copy it over and check if it's correct. Right? It's exactly the same, isn't it? This is the one that wasn't running just now, but now it's started up normally. Previously, it wasn't running properly and was always in the process of starting up. Why was that? Mainly because it was missing our secret. Once we created the secret, it started working properly. So that's our situation. For the second question, right? The main thing is to create our secret based on the 2 existing files to ensure that everything is working properly now. As for the first question, actually the main task is actually to ensure that apart from this key, apart from the secret, except for post, all the other ports are working properly, right? We've already achieved that in the first question. For the second question, we just need to make the secret code work properly as well, restore it. Up to now, all our puts are running normally. Of course, these 2 complete tasks don't count. Complete tasks are one-time tasks, so once they're done, they're done. They won't run again. So except for these 2, everything else is running normally now. Next, it means that after working through these 2 problems, we've finally managed to fix our overall environment. This is basically what we need to do for the security part, right? So, what are we actually ensuring? By using various methods, we aim to make sure that all the nodes, pods, and resources in our system environment and cluster are operating as normally as possible. This is basically what we do on the security side. These are some of the things we handle, and that wraps up the second question. That's the second question. Alright, after finishing, we exit. Just keep exiting. In the last class, we only used 1, right? Only 1 question, so we didn't really talk about exiting, but actually we did mention it, didn't we? In the previous question, we entered twice. Once to sign in as a user, and then once to switch permissions. So this time, what we're doing is... Because this time, what did we actually do? We only switched once. The node, right? We just switched from our base node to the master node without switching users, so what do we need? We only need to exit once. See, after exiting, we've already returned to our base node as normal. So next, for the third question, we just need to enter the node for the third question. Alright, so that's our second question. Now for the third question, let's take a look at its basic requirements over here. Let's go back to the PPT. Alright, for the third question, this one is about security best practices for Docker files. So let's take a look. First of all, the first step is something we won't elaborate on. It's the same for every question. What do we need to pay attention to? For every question, let me remind everyone, switch to the correct host. As for the specific task, first we need to analyze and edit the given Docker file. The path has already been given to us. It's the Docker file located in the Docker directory under the CKS directory. And we need to fix the most prominent security issue in the file. Or in other words, address the instruction related to best practices. Basically, we just need to fix this issue. We need to fix our Docker file, just make the necessary corrections to the Docker file. In addition, we also need to analyze and edit the given manifest file, which is the docker deployment.iml file in our CKS directory. So, for this question, the main task is to analyze these 2 files.
If you want to learn Kubernetes technology or get the CKS question bank, please send me a private message. You can also leave a comment below the video to discuss technology.
One is the Docker file in the Docker directory under the CKS directory, and the other is in CKS at this location, these 2 files. Now what you need to pay attention to here is the following notes for this question. Do not add or delete configurations. You cannot add or delete anything. You can only make modifications based on what already exists. This is something you need to pay attention to in all the questions. Don't just change things at will. If you change something randomly, it might not start up, or even if it does start, it could cause an acute state error. In this case, the impact could be quite significant, and it might not just affect a single question. So, when you're working on each question, after you finish the required tasks for that question, just exit immediately. Don't perform any unnecessary extra operations. There's no need to do anything else. Just do exactly what is required of us, nothing more. Next, let's look at some other points. Here, there's an issue involving privileged users. If we need to use non-root resources to execute this project, we should use the user whose user ID is 65535. And one more thing, actually, this is the most important point. For this question, absolutely do not build a dog file. Absolutely do not build a log file, otherwise what could happen? It could cause our storage space to run out, and what would be the consequence? The consequence would be a score of 0. That's right, 0 points. So do not do it. Because usually, if you're just practicing on your own, right? If you write a Docker file and want to run it yourself, that's perfectly fine, right? It's totally normal and completely acceptable to execute it. But here, if you run it in this specific context, it could cause our storage space to run out, and once that happens, it's 0 points for you. Because once the storage space is exhausted, it will affect the operation of the entire machine. If the cluster status becomes abnormal, then actually, for all your questions, say there are 16 questions, as long as your cluster environment is abnormal, I can't verify any of them, right? For example, if none of your pods or nodes can be connected, how can I verify anything? So in this case, you must pay attention. Never build a Docker file. This is extremely, extremely important. When you're practicing, if you're curious, you can try it out and see what happens, but during the actual exam, absolutely do not execute it. Do not build your Docker file. This is key. That's one point you need to pay attention to. This question could potentially affect a global issue, so you really need to be extra careful here. Next, let's take a look at how exactly to solve this problem. Of course, the first thing we need to do is to actually see it, right? Because even though the question gives us two paths, right? One is the Docker file inside the CKS Docker directory, and the other is the deployment.yml file inside the Docker directory in CKS. The paths are all given to us, but the question itself doesn't mention any specific issues. So what do we need to do? We need to fix the file, but fix what exactly? It doesn't say. This is a bit different from the first question. The first question was actually simpler because it told you exactly what to fix, right? You just had to follow the instructions in the question and make the changes, right? Change what's correct to incorrect and what's incorrect to correct. Just switch the type, and that's it. That was the first question. But for the third question here, it's different. The main issue is what? The main issue is that it only tells you the file, just gives you the location of the file. I'll tell you where the mistake is. This is basically a troubleshooting question. Of course, under normal circumstances, there won't be any major changes, so you can just follow the troubleshooting methods we have in our question bank. First, let's connect to our host, and then we'll start editing the files. Here, we can just edit the first Docker file directly, and we'll go through them one by one. Edit the Docker file first. Let me emphasize again, you only need to use the VM command to make changes. That's enough, nothing else is needed. For example, you don't need to use apply or create. You don't need these build commands, right? These build commands aren't necessary. So it's normal that it's not quit. For our YAML file, that's the next one, since we have two files for these two questions. For the Docker file, don't use apply to deploy it. Also, for the YAML file under deployment, don't use apply and don't use create either. Just a reminder, neither of the two files should be built. You can't build them, only modify them. There's no need to build either of them. Let me emphasize that again. If everyone remembers, I'll go ahead and continue. Next, let's open our terminal. Now, I've already switched to the master 01 directory. After switching over, the first thing we need to do is edit the first file provided in our assignment, which is the Docker file located under the CKS directory inside the CKS folder. Once you open it, you'll see that it's actually used to build something, right? Actually, it's not hard to tell, right? These are all dependencies for our nginx, aren't they? GCC, make, and so on. That's because we're going to compile the source package here, so we need the make command. Then if you look further, you'll see things like OpenSSL. These are our certificates. These are HTTPS certificates, which can be created using this. Created. Then if you look below, you'll see things like net tools, right? Normally all those IP related commands are here. After we've downloaded and installed the dependencies here, right? We add the source package and then we run a few commands, correct? When adding the source package here, as you can see, it actually doesn't perform any decompression operation because that's the effect of the ADD command. The ADD command can automatically extract our compressed package, so there's no need to add a tar command here. It just runs directly. We use the cd command to switch to this directory and then start compiling. As for the compilation here, it doesn't really include much. Basically, it just specifies the path, right? It sets the installation path and specifies this. Our SL module, as well as our status module, that is the NGS status monitoring module, after specifying this module, we start compiling and installing. As for the compilation here, it basically uses 4 processes to compile simultaneously. Here, it's recommended that you have at least around 4 CPUs before proceeding like this. The number specified in make_j is best set to match the number of your CPU cores, as this will give you optimal performance. It won't consume too many resources, it won't be especially resource intensive. If you only have 1 CPU and you set it to 4, then it's very likely to get stuck. Of course, this is fine for NG because NG is relatively small and compiles quickly, but for those that take longer to compile, those that take longer are usually larger. When it comes to source packages, everyone needs to pay attention. Try not to. What should you avoid? Try not to. Make sure that the number at the end matches your CPU as closely as possible. Then the final step is installation. Once it's installed, what else does it create? It creates this for us. This is our user, local engines account, our configuration file. It creates a directory for our configuration files. After switching into it, it also creates a symbolic link and then copies one of our scripts. Then we move on to the final step, which is running the script. The very last step is to execute the script. After that, it copies the configuration files and so on. These are the steps involved. Of course, it's enough for everyone to just be aware of these steps. So first of all, what is the main point of this question? It's about modifying this content, right? Where's the problem? Take a look at this file. Where's the issue? I just explained so much, and why did I do that? It's because we need to modify this file. The question doesn't explicitly tell us what's wrong, but there is a hint in the question. I wonder if you noticed it. What hint is that? It's about the user. The hint says that if we need to use a non-privileged user to run any project, we must use the user nobody with the ID 65535 to execute it. So where is the user here? On the second to last line, we can see that it says user root administrator. Right? So that's not correct, is it? This is where the problem lies. So what do we need to do here? We need to change our administrator to what? Change it to our regular user. I've talked so much about the previous content, and actually, it's all just an introduction. The real issue is that there wasn't any mistake before. I've explained everything from start to finish. The mistake is at the end. It's at the very end. When we get to the bottom at the user section, we need to change root to what? Change it to our nobody. Alright, after making this change here, what do we do next? Next, we just need to save and exit. That's it, nothing else. If you want to execute it, of course, in our practice environment, you can go ahead and run it if you want. But during the exam, you absolutely must not execute it. Absolutely do not run it. If you run this command for this question, you'll get a 0. No one can save you then. No one at all. Alright, next, let's look at the second file and see if there are any issues. First, let's proceed to enter our confidential CKs. Inside, the deployment in the Docker directory and the one outside in the YAML directory are the same, they're just 2 different files. Next, let's go in. For these 2 files, the Docker file execution method is of course different from the way we execute our other files. We won't go into that here because I'm afraid if I mention it, everyone will get curious and want to try it out, and if you end up with a 0 score, that wouldn't be good. So let's not talk any more about those execution methods. We'll actually use this later on, so let's just go ahead and edit it. After entering the file, then what? Alright, so what do we need to pay attention to here? There are a few points. For the previous file, it's not too bad right now because it only involves a user issue, right? Since it only involves the user, we just need to modify the user, that's all. Just change the user. But for our second file, there are a few more mistakes. Just a few more errors in the second file. Where are the problems? First of all, the first issue. there are a few points we need to pay attention to, which are about our... Because in the question, let's review it again. What does it say? First, it mentions the user, right? Second, what else? It just says that we are not allowed to modify or delete the configuration. So you could say that the previous question still gave us some hints, right? But for the second question, or rather the second file, there are relatively fewer hints. Well, it's not that there are no hints at all, because the user is also present here, right? The user actually exists here as well. Let's take a look. So now we need to find it in our file. Find this of ours. Let me see. Here is our private. Private. As for the privilege section, there is some content. And then the running user, yes, that's one. There's also another one, which is read only. Root file system. So here, what exactly is the hint given in the question? The hint in the question is just... It's actually something related to security. It's just a security-related matter. The original wording of the question is to carefully analyze, right? And to meticulously edit, as well as our crucial deployment file. We need to thoroughly fix the specific field within this important file that currently has prominent and significant security issues. The previous question was related to our user. This question is also part of our security section. Actually, you just need to find the security part, the security section. There are three options here. The user's ID, this one of ours. Write permissions, right? And also a privileged container being able to access the host kernel. So, what do we need to change here? First, so do we need to change our user ID? Change it to 65535, right? Because the question mentioned it, but actually there's no problem here. There's actually no problem here. The second point is to ensure that what should the correct values be? The correct value should be ours. Here, it's 65535 in total. Then, for read-only, what do we need to change it to? We need to set it to true. And finally, for priority, we just need to change it to false. These three, right? You need to pay attention to all three of these. You really need to pay attention. Why are there three questions? Because during the exam, you can't be sure which one will be wrong, so you have to watch out for all three. In my case, I only got one of them wrong, but you all need to make sure to change all three. The three 6535s are read only. This one is set to true. And then, privilege is set to false. That's it. That's all you need to do for this question. Don't do anything else, okay? If you do any other operation, you'll get 0 points. If you need the complete question bank, you can leave a comment below. Buy this file database at the highest price, and that's it for today. Goodbye, everyone. Let me emphasize again, for the second and third questions, do not execute them, okay?